Ida B. Wells was born in 1862 in the middle of the Civil War in Holly Springs, Mississippi, which was actually contested territory and kept being claimed by the Confederates and then by the Union. She lived through really tumultuous times. She was also orphaned at an early age. Her parents were killed in the yellow fever epidemic of the 1870s that swept through the Mississippi Valley. And she was left at 16 years old to take care of her 5 surviving brothers and sisters. After her parents passed, their friends were going to take the children and split them up, and I did not want this to happen. She became a teacher essentially to support her brothers and sisters and keep the family together. She's only 16, but she had basic education, which was enough in those days to teach at a rural country school where she'd educate black children. She had a lot of responsibility at an early age, and she managed to somehow rise to it. Wells became a leader in anti-lynching and essentially almost invented it, I would say, because of a sort of terrible personal experience she had. It was a terrible lynching in Memphis in which 3 black men were killed, and one of them was a man named Thomas Moss, a local businessman as well as a local mailman who was a friend of Wells along with his wife. Wells is out of town when this happens, and she comes back to find black people fleeing Memphis, her friend Thomas dead along with 2 other men. She had been thinking that, she would live in the South and she would work to make it a better place. But when she looked at someone like Thomas Moss, who had been a devout churchgoer, taught Sunday school, invested in his own business, done everything that the sort of world said that blacks needed to do to get ahead, and then had ended up being lynched, she began to question whether you could really do anything in the South. She published an editorial that went essentially too far in saying all this, and a white mob stormed the office of the Free Speech and destroyed the printing press. Wells was fortunate she wasn't there, but the mob left a note basically telling whoever was printing the newspaper that they should leave town and putting a death threat. She ended up in New York, where she was hired by T. Thomas Fortune, the publisher of the New York Age, and led what was basically sort of the first anti-lynching campaign, where she identified lynching as a crime and was trying to push the government and social reformers to take action about it. Anti-lynching would become a major commitment for the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and it would also be a major commitment of black women's clubs and other civil rights organizations. Wells seems to have been a sort of natural feminist from the beginning. She never really seemed to see any reason why she couldn't do everything a man could do. And the fact that she had to support her brothers and sisters from an early age may have sort of shaped her idea of herself as someone who was, sort of head of a family. All of her positions on women were progressive. She was always in support of women's votings, a member of various women's suffrage organizations. So she saw how much women could do in terms of influencing public opinion and was eager to encourage women to be activists as well. Her legacy is as someone who had a very radical voice at the turn of the century, which was in many ways not a very radical time. She was a female leader in a time we usually associate with male leadership. To me, she was someone who was so consistently activist and so principled about it that she sort of, in a way, encourages us all to kind of look inside ourselves and ask whether we're doing enough. By the early 1880s, Ida had moved to Memphis, and she was still teaching in rural schools, so she was traveling back and forth to work on what was then a newfangled thing, which was a train. One day, she took her seat in what was then known as the ladies' car. It was the second car on the train. They typically only had 2, and they were reserved for women. They were non-smoking, they were sometimes more comfortable, and Wells had ridden in them previously, but this particular day, she was told that she could not sit in it. She insisted that she could. She had bought a ticket for that car, and she ended up having an enormous fight with the conductor. He tried to pull her out physically. She bit him. They cast her out. She got a ride home in a wagon and immediately sued the railroad. Her suit wound through the courts for several years. In the lower courts, she won. The judge said that she was a respectable-looking person. She was, in fact, a lady, so there's no reason why she shouldn't ride in the lady's car. But when it got to the state Supreme Court, she lost. Tennessee was in the process of implementing segregation during this time, which really took shape after the Civil War, so she couldn't win. She was devastated by not winning, but it turned her into an activist. That was sort of the beginning of her activism, and it was also the beginning of her being a journalist, because she wrote up her experience in a church newspaper called The Living Way.